Hi, I'm Mike DeGroat, host of Sober When I Wrote This, and today's interviewee. The interviewer is my friend and co-host, Tristan Davis. Glad to have you here, my man.
Happy to be here, man. So tell me this vision behind Sober When I Wrote This.
Yeah, so the name Sober When I Wrote This is actually the name of a movie script that Travis and I have been working on for a couple years. We like that name, and the script is just an autobiographical story of both of our stories and how they merged together, and then our relationship of, how we overcame addiction, heartache, and, didn't die. Yeah. But Sober When I Wrote This as a podcast is entirely predicated on what it's like to overcome addiction, maybe more specifically, what it's like to experience suicide and not kill yourself. The thoughts, the ideations, or being low enough to a point where you actually would want to take your life. I had a thought in March of 23. There was a gentleman that I went to rehab with, and I could tell by his activity on media that he was kind of going through it. And so I reached out to him on Messenger and just simply said, "Hey man, thinking about you. Are you doing okay? Are you working your program?" And about 2 days later, he wrote me an essay, and I kind of just looked at it. I didn't think too much of it, and I didn't reach back out. And then 2 months later, he was dead. And that stuck with me because I reached out compassionately, but I never followed up. And I always wondered if it could have been prevented, or what it would have taken to prevent it. And I'm familiar with that pain. I've been there, and so I know what he was going through. And, he wasn't the only one. I've known a lot of people to kill themselves. Gunshot wounds, hanging themselves, overdose, you name it. And they're close, like childhood friends, family members, cousins. And I just have gotten to a point in my life where when I continue to see these things show up, like on media, and I'm close to these people, I find myself complicit in their death because I have a story to tell that I'm not sharing, and I've always thought to myself, there's a reason why I did not die. There's a story that I have to tell. The Lord saw fit to have grace or mercy over my life to bring me to this point. And by not telling it, it's inauthentic, and I felt like I was living in a lie, living in shame. And so Sober When I Wrote This as a podcast is exactly that. It's simply stories of people who were hurting and who are no longer hurting, at least to the degree that they were in the past. And the intention is just to simply help hurting people.
Well, on that note, I want you to tell me where your story begins.
My story begins when I was about 5 years old. My mom married my dad, who raised me. He was not my biological father, and I don't know my biological father. But I remember going into a guy's house when I was about 5 years old, and he was Clint Eastwood, man. He was John Wayne. He was a cowboy. My dad, Pete, who raised me. Big beard, gold chain, Harley Davidson, all the toys, big businessman. I mean, I thought he was famous, right? And for the first 5 years of my life, I didn't have really much of a masculine figure around me. Although I had some uncles that tried really hard. They were, and I loved them, they were in the military and Marines. And so I was the firstborn grandchild of the bunch, and so they kind of took me under their wing, right? But at around 5 years old, my mom married my dad, who raised me, and they had my sister. And for about the next decade or so, it was a bit difficult because each of them were alcoholics. And so I grew up in an alcoholic environment. And I want to be very clear about something. As far as it pertains to my mom and dad, that's what it was like back then. And it's not like that now. And I have the utmost respect and love and admiration for them, for what they've overcome, for what they've been through. And a bit of a retroactive understanding of what it's like when you're running from your own demons, which they were doing themselves. But nevertheless, that really shaped my childhood.
Yeah.
They were gone often. And I remember I would wait up at night in the dark for them just about every single night that they were gone, waiting for them to come home. Because they were out with their friends at the bars and kind of doing their thing. And it just created such anxiety in my life to be there. I had a sister and two brothers, and I felt very much called to protect them from this. So I would put them to bed, I would take care of them. We would clean the house, right? Because, maybe if we cleaned the house when mom and dad got home, they would stay there more often if the house was nice and tidy and everything was organized,
Yeah.
So, for better or worse, that really starts to shape your childhood, and that creates inner wounds and traumas that tend to show up later in life. I, unfortunately, did not recognize those early enough. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, my mom and dad decided to get help. First, my mom went to rehab for 6 weeks, and then my dad went to rehab for 6 weeks. And that was really hard because we lived in a very judgmental community. And it's like, hey, Mike, why is your mom not at your game today? Or, hey, Mike, why is your dad not at your game today? And I just didn't have it in me at that time to be like, well, they're in rehab. Because what the hell are you supposed to tell someone? Well, my parents are alcoholics, actually, Yeah. And so they're gone for 6 weeks, and I'm the man of the house now, at 12 and 13 years old. Again, that conditions me to have all sorts of trauma and wounds. And again, listen, I'm not pointing fingers at them. They're the most lovely people in the world now. And they made it over their hurdles. I'm proud of them for that. But it did put me in a really tough position. Growing up, the other issue that I had was rejection and abandonment. And I've kind of been marked with that my entire life because I don't know my biological father. And when you don't know your dad, you're predisposed to questions of, do I have what it takes? Am I lovable? Am I worthy of love? And things start to turn into like performance-based love.
Yeah.
And because what does a child want? Well, they want to be known. They want to be heard. They want to be seen. And so I kind of was a bit handicapped kind of moving into that. And when my dad, Groot, adopted me, I assumed his name, but I always had this shame because I wasn't a de Groot. And, in the Dutch community, they have this saying, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. And we all kind of laugh about that. But when I was a kid, I took that to heart because I was not Dutch. I went to a Dutch school. I went to a Dutch church. I had Dutch parents. I had Dutch brothers and sisters. And thank God I was tall because the Dutch are very tall. And I already had enough bullshit wrong with me. The very last thing I needed was to be short. So thank God the Lord blessed me with some height because like my sister is 6'1", my brother is 6'7", my other brother is 6'8", and my dad's 6'5". So I already had identity issues about like, well, what the hell is my last name? Who's my dad? So thank God I at least fit in from a from a physical standpoint, like with frame and stature. I wasn't the redheaded stepchild. Like, who the hell's that kid?
Yeah.
But the Dutch they're a very proud people. And my dad had a lot of status and influence, and he was wealthy, and he was a good businessman. And like the presence of all of those things always made me recognize the absence of mine. No matter how much he loved me, no matter how much my mom loved me, no matter how much my brothers and sisters loved me, I was always dealing with these identity issues that eventually led me into, like an imposter syndrome, if you will.
I was going to actually ask you a little bit about that. You've talked to me specifically a lot about battling that imposter syndrome. Would you say that that's connected to your childhood?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because I had no idea who the hell I was.
Yeah.
And even still, I battle that. I battle identity issues. But that's a story as old as time, right? Like, as soon as Adam bit the apple, and came into consciousness, he's hiding behind the bush. And he recognizes that he's naked. And then the Lord comes into the garden. He's like, Adam, where are you? Well, God doesn't ask questions because he needs to know the answer. He's asking the question like, Adam, where the hell are you? And that's kind of been the question I've had to ask myself. Mike, where the hell are you? Well, the reality is I don't know that I've ever known, And so it's been a journey my entire life to establish my identity. And I've, fortunately have been on the good side of the establishment of it, and I have been on the bad side of the establishment of it.
Yeah. So I want to dive into a little bit more of your story, get a little bit deeper. Tell me about your rock bottom.
Which one?
Yeah.
Which one? Well, yeah, so we just talked about my childhood, and it's obvious that a childhood shapes you. And I had a lot of traumas to overcome, and then those traumas, because they were unaddressed and not confronted and not integrated into my life, they started to manifest in different ways that hurt me and hurt a lot of other people. And so there were holes in my heart that I was filling with things that were very temporary and only provided, minimal relief. And ultimately, were self-destructive. So I remember, I guess my first rock bottom was, I jumped in my car. We were living on the dairy, and there was this dirt road that connected my house to my friend's house about 3 miles away. And I was going to watch a football game. And oftentimes I would just jump in the truck, in flip-flops or bare feet, grab a beer, and then head down to go see him. And I was driving about 80 miles an hour at night on that dirt road to go see him, and I hit a steer, a 1,000-pound steer. Wow. And you know how they say your life flashes before your eyes?
Right.
That's exactly what happened. I didn't have my seatbelt on, but I remember this 8mm film going through my mind, and I saw myself from birth all the way to that moment right there. And I thought I was dead. I just ended up in a ditch, and I woke up and I called my friend, and he came and got me. But when I woke up, I knew that it was the hand of God. It wasn't even a steer, it was the hand of God telling me, stop. Stop these things that you're doing. And at this point, my addiction, my alcoholism, these behaviors, I was really good at hiding them. So they weren't really known or seen by anybody. So this was a bit of the Lord whispering, if you will. Stop. But I didn't. And that's the thing about rock bottoms. I always seem to take my shovel with me and dig deeper.
So you told me about a couple of other rock bottoms, and one of those was Lola and the mayonnaise sandwich. Why don't you tell me about that one?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, this disease gets progressively worse. It's fatal and it's progressive. It's cunning, it's baffling, it's powerful. So I would love to say that things got better for me after I smacked that steer, but they only got worse. And by getting worse, at around 2014, I was in full addiction mode. And I had become unfaithful in my marriage. I was doing coke. I was doing Percocets. I was gambling. I was drinking alcohol every day. Whiskey in my coffee at 5 a.m. type stuff. And you can't do that. You can't do those things and expect your loved ones to stay with you. So I had given my wife at that time, a lot of reasons to leave me. And we tried to work through some things of which we just could not get over. And we were moving towards separation. But Lola came to me and said, Dad, I thought the reason that you left the house was because I didn't put enough mayonnaise on your sandwich. And I thought to myself, can you imagine being, a 12 or a 13-year-old girl thinking that the reason her dad left is because there wasn't enough mayonnaise on a sandwich? It wasn't much later that her mom and I divorced, and then she came to me and said, I don't believe in true love anymore. When you recognize that you're responsible for that feeling in your daughter, the weight that it takes on and over your life is damn near unbearable. And so, but what do you do with that pain? You only know one thing: more of what you've already been doing. More alcohol, more drugs, more gambling, more anything that would take away that pain.
Do you think when she told you that you recognized at that moment that was your responsibility? That your actions had caused those feelings for her? Or do you think it was later on that you realized that?
Well, when you start to own your behavior and you go through recovery, you really start to empathize with those that you hurt. So you might scratch the surface just as a father in the beginning, or as a husband too. But the further you get away from those things and the further into recovery, you start to open your mind and start to think straight, and you start to recognize, like, I really hurt these people. I gave them all of the reasons and the evidence and the ammo to not trust me, to not love me, to distance themselves from me so that they could protect themselves. I was out of control.
Yeah. So we've talked about this before, you and I, and I think this is a good opportunity to go into this, but what were your thoughts like at this point in your life? This is clearly one of the lower, if not the lowest point in your life. So help me understand what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this was definitely the lowest point in my life. At this point, I think we were in March or April of 2016.
Okay.
And all of my lies were coming to roost. They were exposed, and you can only run from those things for so long. And I was dealing with Lola, having thought those things. I had business issues, with my business partner, my dad, and then of course my wife at the time. She, was aware of all of the things that were going on, and man, the pain and the shame that I was dealing with, and rightfully so, right? Like, okay, if you're going to make these decisions, this is what's going to happen. And you have to accept that responsibility. But the issue I had is I still was in victimhood at that point. It was everybody else's problem. I had a license to behave the way that I was behaving. Anytime anybody would try to weaponize my behavior against me, I would sit there and say, hey, listen, do you know what happened to me? Do you know what that person did? Do you know what happened in my childhood? Do you know what's going on in the business? Do you know all of these injustices that have happened to me?
Yeah.
Kind
of had a response to everyone's questions, or
so much pride, so much ego. It was everybody's fault but myself. But I didn't know better. That's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. But what that eventually brought me to is my knees. And in, I think April or May, I was at the dairy. We had a house there, like a mobile home. And I had moved out of our house. And I had nothing left. Cat was out of the bag. The whole town knew what was going on. I had to step down as the vice president of the school board. I was the drummer in the praise band at church. I had to leave that. I was part of the church council at our church. I was heavily involved with my daughters, like as their coach.
Very involved in the community.
I was very involved in the community, yeah. I think it took a lot of people by storm, like, you have got to be kidding me. It's like, no, if they only knew the amount of effort it took to keep those lies going, you know. But anyhow, I ended up on a couch, and I had reasoned myself down to ending my life because I had nothing left to give. And so I sat there in perfect clarity, you know. But I mean, it's funny, I was hopped up on all sorts of benzodiazepines, a bottle of whiskey, you know, chain smoking cigarettes. And I just kind of sat there in the corner, and I went and got my gun and I sat it on my lap, and I went through why it made sense to end my life. And I had it planned out. And this is why I want to make this podcast, because I know there are people hurting like I was hurting. And so unless I tell the details of my specific story, you know, I don't know if they're in a position to maybe unlock their mind or unchain their heart. And so that's why I really want to get down to the specifics here. So I sat there and I thought, I'll shoot myself in the milk pit at the dairy because it'll be quick cleanup. Just hose me down. So I knew where I would do it. I knew how I would do it. And I was just running through when I would do it. You know, I was certainly going to get a divorce. I was dealing with overwhelming shame, isolation, because who the hell wants to hang out with me, right? And I was alone. And so, you know, it's really sad to say this, because I think you know how much I love my daughters. So the very last thing that I needed to rationalize was my daughters living without their father. And I was so sick and so sad and so hurt that I figured that their life would be easier without me than with me. I was there for a few hours going through all of these thoughts. And I hung out on that one for about 30 minutes. Their names and how they looked, they kept going through my head. And to give you an idea of how powerful suicidal thoughts are, is that the presence of them in my life was not more powerful than the thoughts of suicide. So it was right at that time that I understood when I was going to do it. But a voice kind of from on the other side of the couch, almost audibly, spoke to me. And it was as if Jesus was sitting there on the side of the couch with me, a perfect gentleman. It's like, I almost saw him too. It's like his legs were crossed and he was in like his white robe, you know. And here I am with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded gun, chain smoking cigarettes, you know. And he spoke to me with such mercy and free will. And he said, you know, Mike, you actually have something left to give. And then I thought to myself, well, no, I don't. I've sat here for 2 hours. I have nothing left to give this world. And he goes, you have your next breath. And I thought, damn, he's right. So I was literally down to my last breath, and that's the only thing I had left to give this world. And it's as if he said to me, that breath belongs to me, him. That's his breath inside my lungs. But you can do with it as you please. And that's really where I started to understand the free will that I have in life. But I also understood that that's where the truth sets you free. Because he was right. I had one last breath to give. And so he said, if you give me that breath, I'll multiply it for you. So I said, all right. I uncocked my gun. And I put it back in the nightstand, threw the whiskey away. I threw all my anti-psych and antidepressant meds down the drain. I said, here you go. I'm all in. And it wasn't that much longer that I checked myself into rehab. I knew I needed a timeout. I had to put my life back together. I wasn't ready to live, but I wasn't ready to die anymore.
Yeah. You've told me that story before. And it still has the same weight and impact as the first time you told me. And I mean, that's something we talk about, you and I, all the time. That next breath, we'll be there on our Tuesday morning workouts. We're getting our freaking butt kicked. And we're out there, breathing, struggling together. And I'll look at you and go, still got that next breath, Mike. Yeah. And it keeps us going, right? Yeah. So you checked yourself into rehab. So tell me a little bit about what rehab was like.
Yeah. Well, I remember going to rehab. I didn't have anybody that would drive me to the damn airport. I had one friend, Chuck Delma was his name. He was a good buddy. I called him. I said, "Hey, I got to go to rehab. Will you take me to the airport? I don't got anybody that'll take me." Now I want to be clear. I gave everybody a reason not to take me. I'm just trying to set this up. I'm trying to multiply my breath, and I have nobody on my side. But Chuck Dalma took me to the airport, and that was really kind of him to do that. And so I flew in to Phoenix, and here's the irony. It was the same fucking rehab that my mom and dad went to. Calvary Rehabilitation Center in Phoenix, Arizona. Anyhow, I guess God has a sense of humor, right?
Right.
I sat outside by a fountain, and I smoked 2 packs of cigarettes back to back, and I kept playing this one song by Bethel, "It Is Well With My Soul." I played that song, what must have been 100 times in a row during intake because they couldn't get me in right away. But I was just sitting there in the 90-degree sun. And I said, I don't care what happens from this point forward. I will sing this song when I leave, that it is well with my soul, no matter what comes up, no matter what consequences I have to face, it will be well with my soul. So in a way, I was prophesying that. They took me in. I weighed 178 pounds. Now, to put that in perspective, I weigh about 225 right now. And I weighed 178 pounds. They're taking all my blood tests. I remember, they're like, well, what's your drug of choice? And I was like, well, what do you got? What do you got? Anything that'll take the pain away, But that's everybody's first question when you get into rehab. And I remember my dad, the one person that talked to me before rehab was my dad. And he said, you're going to go there and you're going to tell yourself that you're not like any of these people, but you are exactly like them. And I went in, and man, I was blown away. Because, I was. I was like all of them. All of our best decisions landed us inside a rehab, safe to say no one was on a winning streak there. But anyhow, the one thing that I learned in rehab, probably that really moved the needle for me, was Saturdays was family day, every Saturday. And as no shock to anyone, I didn't have any family that visited me for obvious reasons. But my daughters would send me colorings, and they would write me notes. My wife at the time, in spite of how much I hurt her, she still engineered that for the kids to reach out to their dad. And on the family weekends, I would read their notes and their colored pictures. I still have those. But I had a sponsor, and his name was Gabe. And he goes, Mike, we're going to start doing your step work together on the weekends here. I said, all right, well, what the hell is that? And while we had already done like step 1 and step 2, I'm powerless over alcohol. My life had become unmanageable. Became willing to turn my life over to to someone that could help me, right? To someone who could do what I could not do for myself. But there's these steps to get there. And there's a willingness associated with it. Basically, became willing to turn my life over to God as I understood him, so that he would create order in my life. But step 4 is create a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. And so what that is it's a resentment list is what we call it. But I didn't understand. I didn't really understand what this was, but the sponsor kind of leads you through this. And so he goes, you know what, Mike? Man, I want you to make a resentment list. And this really piqued my interest. And I was like, really? Because man, and you're going to validate that? Because finally, someone's going to listen to all the fucked up shit that's happened to me. I'm going to justify my existence as a victim. This is one of the steps. I was blown away. I was so excited, right? And he goes, yeah. I want to know what happened to you, who did it, and how it made you feel. I want you to write 3 columns. And I had never been so excited to do some homework in my life. Now, these step 4s, they can take people years. And many never finish them because you have to dig deep. And you have to go to places that you don't want to talk about because you've tucked a lot of that shit away, But he helped me expose it. He got me pretty excited about it. And so it took me about a week to do it. And he goes, next week when I'm here, I want you to tell me all of these things. And so in all of my free time for an entire week, I started to make this resentment list. Who hurt me, what they did, how it made me feel. Man, I had 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of yellow paper. And I get there and I'm so excited to share with him, because someone's finally going to validate all of the injustice in my life. And maybe I might justify my inappropriate responses to those injustices. But that was not the case. So I sat down and Gabe says, okay, very good job. I could tell that this is thorough because that's part of it. And he goes, now what's your role in all of this? What do you mean what my role is in all of this? You asked me to tell you a story of basically all the bullshit that has happened to me. And he goes, yeah, and what is your responsibility in it? What is your role in all of these things? And I didn't have it in my mind at the time to understand that everything that happens to me is my responsibility, no matter what. I have to find my responsibility. It's radical responsibility. It's radical ownership. And I'd never understood that concept because I had been a victim my entire life. But the point being, I sat there and I was baffled and I went to him and I was like, Gabe, look, I just don't understand what you're talking about. And he's starting to get angry here because the reality is my ego and my pride were here and he was trying to introduce humility into my life. And that's a virtue that I had no idea about.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly knew about pride. Like, the Lord's pretty clear about what happens, when you're prideful, and I certainly had experienced that, but I hadn't experienced, the promises of humility yet. So he's trying to introduce this. And so I'll never forget when my perspective changed, because Gabe and I were going back and forth, and it was escalating, and now I'm getting angry because, well, you tricked me, first of all. This is not what you wanted. Now you want to know my responsibility? And finally I gave up. I said, I don't know what my responsibility is, Gabe. And he goes, you know what your responsibility is? That you're fucking 36 years old and you've waited this long to take care of the shit in your life. You're a husband, you're a father, you're a businessman, and you're still a fucking victim. Maybe that's your responsibility.
Wow.
It was that honest and aggressive approach that changed everything for me. Now, I wasn't set free at that moment, but again, the truth in so many ways was like, yeah. Like, how long are you going to hang on to resentments from 5 and 6 and 10 and 18 and 22 and 25? Like, do you think the people that hurt you when you were those ages are thinking about the things that they did to you for that many years? Probably not. So I went back to work and I figured out my responsibility in all of this, and it really introduced the idea that to fully recover, you needed to own not only the things that you did to others, but the things that people did to you. And in so many ways, that put me in a position to kind of start to get my mind right.
Well, I want to shift gears now. We've gotten past rehab and recovery. Tell me about your 90 and 90.
Oh, yeah, 90 and 90 in Clovis. So when you get out of rehab, they encourage you to make 90 meetings in 90 days. So I went to the Clovis AA. And now at this point, though, the only thing I wasn't doing at this point was using.
So you were sober at this point?
Yeah, I was clean and sober.
Okay.
But I get out of rehab, and my wife wants a divorce. And of course she does, Like, I had to accept that. My dad is like, yeah, we're no longer business partners. And so I'm losing my marriage, I'm losing my job, I have no place to live, which, look, I'm not making light of it. I'm just saying that these are the things that happen when you make the decisions I made.
Right. It's just the reality.
It's just the reality of it, right. So it's not, I don't ever want to be like a woe is me. Not at all. In fact, like quite the opposite. Like, everyone is justified in the way that they're treating me,
But it's still part of your story.
But it's part of my story, So, yeah, so I'm in 90 and 90, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot in AA. We would say, or I would say that, Jesus saved my soul, but AA saved my ass. And the reason for that is it taught me how to behave in ways that would introduce good thinking. So I was not going to think my way into good behavior, but I was going to be able to behave my way into good thinking. And that's what AA did. AA is where pride goes to die. And I liked those people that were there.
Yeah.
I learned a lot there.
So at this point, you're past rehab, you're sober at this point. Now tell me about the people in your life that really made a difference at this point in your life.
Well, there was a guy in town who I had known of but had never talked to him before. Spencer Odom was his name. And we talked about his dad on the previous podcast with Travis. Right. And I don't know how we crossed paths. I think it was like a men's prayer group or something like that. But I saw these things that he had. And I saw his life, his wife, his children, his jobs. And the one thing I was certain of is that I didn't know how to make any good decisions. And I didn't want to make any decisions at all because, all of my decisions just put me in rehab. They got me divorced. My decisions got me out of a really good job with my dad, like a third-generation job. Yeah. So I was not good at decisions. But what I was good at least at that point, was critical thinking. So I was able to get to a point and see like, oh, I'm attracted to that guy's life. Maybe if I modeled my life after his, or he gave me some pointers, I might get things back on track. So I just went up to him and I said, hey man, like, looks like you got a lot of things going for you. It looks like you really love the Lord. I understand that you've been through some shit too. Will you help me out? And that guy poured himself into me in ways that I couldn't even explain. Time, money, effort. And when you don't have anybody and you're in a small town, and you could imagine the stories that were being spread about me, and what I would say is, well, I mean, that person probably doesn't know me too well because there's a lot worse things they could have told you than just that.
Right.
He really sheltered me and shielded me from a lot of that. There was another guy that really helped me, and he and I are really good friends now. And this is about as paradoxical as it gets. Chris Ralston was his name. And I love Chris. But our relationship started with me fleecing him out of $100,000.
It's an interesting way to start a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you want to hear that story?
Yeah, let's hear it. That's a story I think you can't just start with not tell.
I had access to excess until I stopped having access to excess. And so that'll take you far fast. And the problem with that is when you go the wrong way, you go a long way, but the wrong way. And so certain things were being cut off from me. But I needed money to fuel all of my habits, And so I went to a bank that we banked with. And I met Chris there, and I had him write me up a $100,000 loan. And it was unsecured. And I tricked him, manipulated him basically into, funding all of this, forged the documents and everything, and I got my money. And by doing that, it, put me in a position to last a little bit longer out there, doing my thing and supplying all of my habits. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is when I was in rehab, he caught wind that I was in rehab, and the note, or at least the interest-only payments, started to become due. And so I was at rehab, and my dad called me. He goes, "What the hell is this?" Because when you're in addiction, you just start to peel layers back of more bullshit, and the people who love you are like, "You have got to be kidding me." Really the only way to do it is to do a full disclosure. Look, this is everything. Boom. And I wasn't at that point yet because I was in rehab. So he goes, "It's the day you get out, we're going in there and you're going to have to figure this shit out." So I think my dad, no, another guy picked me up from the airport and brought me home. And the second I got home, my dad goes, "Get in the car." And we go to the bank. And I'm sitting down with Chris and the CEO of the bank, and I have to sit there and tell them exactly what happened. That was the first meeting that I had after rehab. Yeah, here's what I did, man. It was fraudulent. Here's how I signed it. Here's what I did with it. And I cannot pay you back. So they made my dad a deal where he assumed the $100,000 debt, but they lowered his interest rate. So in a way, he actually was making money by assuming $100,000 but getting a lower interest rate. Not that all of us were celebrating that.
Right.
Under the circumstances. But I'll tie all of this together. A year or so after that, I get a phone call from Chris. And he goes, "Dude, I have to repent to you." And I'm like, "It's Chris? What? Repent to me for what?" And he goes, "Dude, I see how good your life seems to be going insofar as putting it back together." It's not like I had a bunch of big wins, but I wasn't dead and I was out there and I had a job. And he goes, "Dude, I have been so resentful for what you did to me. I have so much unforgiveness for you. In fact, I'm obsessing over it and the Lord just put on my heart to call you and tell you to ask for your forgiveness. And I said, are you serious? And he goes, yeah. I said, let's go out to lunch or something like that. So I met him for lunch, and he shared with me where he was at, and I shared with him where I was at, and I needed a ton of help because my money was all fucked up, and I didn't know where to start, and he was a banker, so he knew what was going on. And he goes, yeah, I'll absolutely help you with stuff like that, if you're interested. And so that's only the start of it. But again, like with this relationship started on deception, and now I'm with the guy that I actively deceived, and he's saying, look, I'll help you. I'll help you put your life back together financially. So he puts me on like Dave Ramsey. He puts me on Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He puts me on Think and Grow Rich. He's putting me on all these books. In fact, I actually became, I rented a house from him eventually too, and he charged me under market rent to live there. I mean, I can't tell you enough about this guy, but let me fast forward exactly to what happened. So as things got better for me financially, he and I stayed in touch, and he had a missionary friend who was trying to raise money for a mission project in Zambia. And right around this time, I was getting pretty close to launching a startup, and we had capitalized the company. And so I had access to some decent cash, and I wanted to give like a large gift away to someone. And Chris helped me find that, this missionary needed help. And we wound up building like basically a church in Zambia with a large gift that I was able to give them. And from what I understand, thousands of people there have now accepted Christ at that church since it was built. And I guess like it's wild to me to understand that is a consequence of a relationship that started with deception. Mm-hmm. And if I could only tell you all of the other things that Chris has done for me, he's like one of the most godly men I know. Acts like Jesus, who else? Well, Travis.
Yeah.
Oh,
of course.
Travis, yeah. He's always there for me to call, to reach out to tell him about my bullshit or my thoughts or wherever I'm at. He's not judgmental. He told me one time, he goes, Mike, you're like water. Everything around you grows. Yeah. And that really helped shift my mindset. Like, yeah, I've done a few things. It looks like things are growing in the right direction. So all of this to say, like, I went through the ringer, and I put so many other people through the ringer. I just started to understand that there had to be a bigger purpose than just being alive, because I thought I should have died when I hit the steer, and I should have died from the amount of cocaine that I was using, and I should have died when I cold turkey detoxed off of benzodiazepines, which I didn't even understand at the time. Like, those are the worst to cold turkey detox from. Mm-hmm. I was having convulsions like this for the next year and a half, and I didn't even know what it was until I asked a doctor, and he's like, are you kidding me? He goes, you should have died. So all of these things continued to happen. But I'll tell you a story, again, like Chris, to fund all of my addictions and all of my habits, I needed a lot of money. And there was a guy, a friend one time, he borrowed me $15,000. And this is like right at the end, like right before rehab, when things were getting bad. And when I got out of rehab, I called him and I said, hey, look, man, I want to pay you back. I don't even know when it'll be, and it might be never. But I want to try to pay you back. He goes, all right, brother, whenever you get a chance. So a few years went by, and like a few more years went by. So I think I borrowed that like in 2015 or something like that. And then, we're like in 2020, and I finally got to the point where I was able to pay him back. Yeah. And so I sent him a check for like $15,000. And I, wrote a note in there. I said, man, thank you so much. I can't believe that you waited this long. And I know that you never would have even asked for it, but here it is, and thank you. And I never thought twice about it, He cashed the check, and he wasn't really in my life, so I didn't know. But about a year later, another guy came back into my life, a really good friend here. And I reached out to him, and he goes, yeah, man, you and I are not cool. And again, justifiably so. I said, what's going on? He goes, you owe JD money. I said, I paid him. And I was, at this point, like, my life was getting a lot better financially. We had launched some startups and things were doing good. And I like, with pride and with ego, like, ran to my check register, took a picture. I was like, look, bro, I paid him. But it was more what I wanted was his friendship back. Like, because I understood that was his boundary. That if I didn't pay this guy, that, he and I weren't going to be friends. Yeah. And so he goes, he's dead, and you didn't pay him. I said, no, I did. It's cashed. And he sent me the obituary. And on the obituary, it read that the day after he cashed the check, he died. And I never understood, like, Lord, I don't get this. This doesn't make sense to me. But it was not nothing. He was a young guy. It was a pulmonary embolism. But it was the day after he cashed the check that he had died. I can't explain those things. The only thing I can say is that from these stories, it's like God has a greater purpose for me than to just be here and be some addict or alcoholic, And so that's why I wanted to tell this story of where I'm at and what I'm doing.
I appreciate you being vulnerable and honest and sharing your story. I do want to end with one final question. What would be the last thing you would want your daughters to know about your love for them if this was the last time you could share it?
Yeah. Well, that I love them with my whole heart. And it may not always have been expressed to the degree that they needed it to be. But I was doing my best. I would want them to know that I was doing my best. That I love them, that I believe in them, that I believe they're set apart. Lola's my lion. She's meant to take territory. She's been raised that way. She's strong and powerful and discerning and wise. And she's the lion. And I would want her to know to go take all of that territory. It's already been ordained. It's been prayed for. The Lord's hand is on her life. Something fierce. Sophia is my diamond. She's the crown jewels that you keep in the safe. The rubies, the emeralds. That you only show to a few different people because they're so precious. That's Sophia. Sophia's like Bridgerton, the diamond, There's always the diamond in Bridgerton. That's Sophia. She's breathtaking. She's gorgeous and has a heart of gold. I would want her to know that I believe that in her. And then there's Nina, my baby. There's no telling exactly what her potential is going to be. Like the upper limits of that may be something that I've never even known before or imagined. She's brilliant. She's smart. She's whip smart. She's gorgeous. These big brown eyes. She always had blonde hair. It's starting to get a little darker. But I would say, I love that the Lord blessed me with a child with blonde hair. Because I didn't want her to feel different than her sisters. But the upper limits of Nina's potential are still a ways out there because she's still so young. But her presence, Nina's presence makes a difference in my life and in the lives of others. Just her nearness, her laugh and her touch and her hug. And I would just want the girls to know that this life is not easy. And you don't get to not suffer. But you can choose your suffering. And I would pray that they would be strong and protected and powerful, and that they would meet men of God that would help them serve. And that I hope that they'll have stories just as powerful as mine, but without having to go through the hardship.
So I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one more. What's up with the flowers?
The flowers. My favorite color, man, purple. So it's just a reminder. I know it's cliche, but stop and smell the roses, right? Like, there's no more big deals in life. Take your time. Don't run the red lights. It's unnecessary. But the color, I like to keep flowers in the house, specifically purple flowers, because purple's the color of royalty. And in my life, I have struggled with my identity my entire life. Who am I? Where do I come from? Do I have what it takes? Am I lovable? And I was marked with that as a child when my biological father left. But, the Lord has brought me through so much with the presence of another man who raised me, who I love so dearly, my dad. Because he didn't have to do any of that. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make with purple is that it reminds me of my identity. And there's this saying that wages are earned because of what you do, but an inheritance is gained because of who you are. And so that's what I've accepted, is that there's no amount of performance that could change what the Lord has already created for me. My inheritance is simply because I belong. And since I belong, I can believe. And since I believe, I can behave. And those purple flowers remind me of that.
That's awesome.
Thank you for joining the podcast. I'm hopeful that this would be helpful for those who are suffering, that people who either are directly or indirectly connected to suicide or addiction or alcoholism could find some similarities here and find some relief and a pathway forward. But I can assure you that if I could make it back from one breath, that is all you need. Thank you.